What if the most disturbing part of this story wasn't what happened inside the mansion, but what was hidden beneath it? Let that question sit with you for a moment. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because when most people heard the headlines, they thought they understood what this case was about. A wealthy Hollywood figure, a brutal double homicide, a son arrested, a tragedy that seemed shocking, yes, but ultimately contained. Tragic, horrifying, but explainable, or so it seemed. But what if the house itself was only the surface layer of the story? What if the real mystery had been buried, literally, out of sight, out of mind, waiting for decades beneath manicured lawns and stone walkways? That's where this story truly begins. Not with the sirens, not with the arrests, not even with the bloodshed that first captured the world's attention. It begins underground. On a quiet stretch of Brentwood, behind gates that most people will never pass through, sits a $13.5 million estate long associated with success, creativity, and Hollywood prestige. A place meant to symbolize achievement, stability, legacy, the kind of home that feels permanent, untouchable, safe, until suddenly, it wasn't. Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife Michelle, 70, were found stabbed to death inside that estate. The news spread fast, faster than facts, faster than understanding. Shock rippled through Hollywood, through fan communities, through social media feeds that struggled to reconcile the image of a beloved public figure with the brutality of the crime scene being quietly pieced together behind police tape. Within hours, attention turned to the guest house. Nick Reiner, 32, their son, living on the property. He was arrested that same night and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. For many people, that was the end of the story. A horrific family tragedy. A broken household. Another reminder that wealth and fame can't shield anyone from violence. Case closed, at least emotionally. But investigators don't operate on emotional closure. And what happened next is where everything begins to fracture. Because after the arrest, the searches didn't stop. Ask yourself this. If the suspect is already in custody, why would investigators return to the property? Not for a walkthrough, not for photographs, but with equipment designed to look beneath the ground itself. That's not routine. That's not standard. That's not something you do unless something doesn't sit right. At first, there were whispers, then leaks, then carefully worded phrases slipped into official statements. Phrases most people missed because they didn't know what to listen for. Follow-up investigative procedures. Additional forensic interest. Areas previously unexplored. Previously unexplored. Think about that. This wasn't about what was visible. It was about what had been hidden. Sources familiar with the investigation would later describe a moment when the tone shifted entirely. The urgency drained away and was replaced with something colder, heavier, more deliberate. Instead of asking, "Who did this?" investigators began asking, "What else is here?" And that question changes everything. Because homes tell stories, not just through what they display, but through what they conceal. Renovations, additions, alterations, places where blueprints don't quite match reality. Spaces that exist without a clear reason. Basements that go deeper than expected. Ground that looks disturbed but long settled. Soil that doesn't behave the way it should. This is where federal attention becomes important. Local authorities handle crimes. Federal agencies look for patterns. They look for timelines that don't add up. They look for connections that predate the crime itself. They look for evidence that suggests something larger than a single night of violence. And according to multiple reports, that's exactly what triggered the next phase of this investigation. Ground-penetrating radar. Now, if you're not familiar with it, here's why that matters. Ground-penetrating radar isn't brought in casually. It's used to detect anomalies beneath the surface, voids, objects, disturbances that don't occur naturally. It's used at archaeological sites, disaster zones, and yes, criminal investigations where there's reason to believe something has been intentionally concealed, buried. So ask yourself, what would justify using it here? What could investigators possibly think was beneath a luxury Hollywood estate that warranted federal-level scanning of the soil? This is where the story begins to feel uncomfortable, because early scans reportedly revealed irregularities. Not random, not consistent with natural erosion or standard construction debris. Irregular shapes, defined edges, patterns that suggested human involvement. And suddenly, This wasn't just a crime scene anymore. It was a site, a place where something had been done, not recently, but deliberately, methodically, with enough confidence that whoever did it believed it would never be uncovered. That belief is important, because people don't bury things unless they think they'll stay buried. And that raises a terrifying question. What kind of secret is worth hiding underground instead of destroying completely? Money? No. Documents? Maybe, but unlikely. Objects tied to memory? To guilt? To leverage? Or something far worse? As investigators began quietly requesting excavation permissions, a strange tension settled over the case. Publicly, the narrative remained focused on the murders. Privately, attention was drifting downward, away from the rooms, the furniture, the visible signs of violence, and toward the earth itself. And here's the contradiction that should stop you cold. If this case was truly straightforward, why were investigators widening the scope? Why were they treating the property as if it might contain evidence unrelated to the night of the killings? Evidence from another time, another story, another victim. At this stage, no official statements confirmed what was suspected. Everything was careful, controlled, vague. But that vagueness wasn't accidental. It was protective. Because what was being hinted at, never stated outright, was the possibility that this property had been used for something far more sinister than anyone had ever imagined. A place not just of living, but of storing, hiding, preserving secrets that were never meant to be found. Think about how unsettling that is. You can walk over something every day and never know it's there. You can host guests, throw parties, raise a family, all while standing on top of a story that's been silently waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the ground to finally give up what it's holding. And that moment may have come only because of the murders. That's another question you should be asking yourself right now. What if this hidden layer of the story would never have been discovered? If the violence had never happened? What if the crime didn't just end lives, but exposed something buried long before? As excavation teams prepared to dig, there was reportedly a noticeable shift in atmosphere. Not panic, not chaos, dread. Because once you disturb the ground, you can't put the truth back. Whatever was there, whatever had been intentionally hidden, was about to surface. And when it did, investigators would realize they weren't just dealing with the aftermath of a single horrific act. They were standing at the edge of a much older mystery. One that raised questions no one had been asking. One that hinted at a past that had never been resolved. One that suggested the murders might not be the beginning of this story, but the consequence of something far deeper. So before we go any further, ask yourself this. If the ground beneath a mansion could talk, what would it say? Because in the next section, we're going to walk through the moment investigators realized the soil itself was trying to tell them something. And once they listened, nothing about this case would ever look the same again. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. The first thing to understand is that most people never think about what happens after an arrest. Headlines flare. Social media explodes. The story is solved in the public's mind. But investigators? They're just getting started. Because in their world, a suspect behind bars doesn't end a case. Sometimes it only sharpens the focus. In the case of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the initial crime scene investigation had already been extensive. Officers combed every room, dusted every surface, collected every shard of potential evidence. But within days, whispers began among the federal task force assigned to oversee aspects of the investigation. Not about Nick Reiner, not about the guest house, not about the obvious signs of the attack. It was about the estate itself. A house this large, this expensive, doesn't just exist. Every corner, every foundation slab, every walkway is meticulously mapped. Any anomaly can be spotted by the trained eye. And that's exactly what some investigators saw during follow-up visits. Slight depressions in the soil near the backyard, inconsistencies in the landscape. Things that didn't match the original blueprints of the property. Now, a casual visitor would never notice these things. A lawn that dips slightly in one area, or a section of garden where the plants look unnaturally arranged, seems trivial. But trained investigators don't overlook trivialities. And once a single anomaly is noticed, the mind begins to ask questions. Is this random? Is it natural? Or was it placed here intentionally? It was intentional. The second search was authorized not because there was any concrete evidence pointing to additional criminal activity, but because investigators suspected there might be more. That's an important distinction. Suspicion is all it takes to bring in specialized equipment. And in this case, that equipment was something the Reiners, or anyone else, would likely never imagine being brought onto their property: ground-penetrating radar. The purpose of GPR is deceptively simple. A radar device sends signals into the ground and measures the return signals. Differences in density or composition show up as anomalies. Human bones, buried objects, voids, metal containers, all register differently from the natural soil. It's commonly used in archaeology, construction, and, in criminal cases, to find graves or hidden evidence. It's precise, meticulous, and unyielding. When investigators rolled the equipment onto the Reiner estate, they weren't expecting drama. They were expecting answers, or at least reassurance that the soil hadn't been disturbed. They didn't get reassurance. Almost immediately, the radar revealed unexpected voids beneath the surface, spaces clearly unnatural. They weren't the result of tree roots or drainage pipes. They weren't remnants of past landscaping. They were cavities, deliberate and methodical, hidden under layers of earth that had been carefully tamped down. Imagine for a moment standing there, staring at the monitor. Lines and blips fill the screen, telling a story the eye cannot see. The earth beneath you, flat, perfect, serene, is actually hiding a secret, waiting silently for someone to notice. And that's precisely the feeling that gripped the investigators. It was quiet, unnerving, almost reverent. So they dug. The excavation was slow. Every inch of soil removed was cataloged, bagged, and photographed. Metal detectors swept the area. Every shift in the soil brought new questions. At first, the team unearthed nothing more than fragments of household items and remnants of landscaping materials. But then, beneath a particularly deep section, they found containers. Sealed, placed with intent, hidden in such a way that casual observation, or even a determined intruder, would never discover them. These weren't the sorts of containers you find in a garden shed. They were constructed to endure time, moisture, and pressure. The care with which they were buried suggested forethought. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure what was inside remained hidden indefinitely. Investigators' curiosity and apprehension spiked. What would compel someone to bury something on the estate? And why here? Some early speculation pointed to the mundane: old documents, tax records, family heirlooms. But as the dig continued, the items uncovered began to tell a different story. Personal objects that didn't belong to any current resident. Items of an unusual nature, each one raising more questions than it answered. One agent later described the moment they opened a container as surreal. Not horrific, not dramatic, but surreal. Because the objects inside weren't just old, they were significant. Objects that could connect to events decades earlier. Objects that might belong to individuals no one had seen in years. Objects that suggested a story no one had expected to be uncovered in the backyard of a celebrity mansion. It's important here to pause and consider. Investigators are trained to remain impartial. They are taught not to jump to conclusions, to rely solely on evidence. And yet, even among seasoned professionals, there are moments when the context of what's found transcends procedural analysis. When objects hint at a narrative too strange, too intricate, or too unsettling to ignore. That was one of those moments. The implications were staggering. If these buried items truly linked to events outside the immediate crime, then the Reiner murders were no longer just a standalone incident. They were the tip of a deeper, more complex history, one in which the property itself had been an unknowing witness. The second search, then, became a turning point. It shifted the investigation from a straightforward homicide case to something more layered, more intricate. Each dig, each removed container, each piece of evidence added complexity. And as the story began to unfold, the questions multiplied. Who placed these objects here? How long had they been buried? Why hadn't anyone discovered them before? And most unsettling of all, was the recent tragedy somehow connected to what lay beneath the ground? These questions would hang over the investigation like a shadow. Each one demanded answers. And yet, at this stage, the answers remained tantalizingly out of reach, just beyond the investigators' grasp. By the end of the initial excavation, the team had uncovered enough to warrant further attention. Federal agencies, forensic specialists, and historians were quietly consulted. Even the casual timeline of the property was questioned. Construction records, renovation permits, and landscape plans were revisited with new scrutiny. Every anomaly, no matter how small, was now a clue. For the outside world, this was just another detail in a sensational case. For the team on the ground, it was a profound reminder of why nothing, no property, no legacy, no apparent normalcy, can ever be taken at face value. And here's the crucial realization. The second search wasn't just about uncovering objects. It was about uncovering truth. About peeling back layers of intentional concealment. About confronting the uncomfortable possibility that some stories aren't linear, that some secrets are maintained for decades, and that tragedy, like the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner, can inadvertently shine light on something far older and far more enigmatic. The story of the underground discoveries had only just begun, and as the investigators prepared for what would come next, there was an unspoken tension in the air. Everyone knew that whatever lay buried was waiting, and when it finally came into view, it would change the understanding of the Reiner estate forever. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. When investigators first brought in the ground-penetrating radar, the goal was simple: confirm whether the landscape had been disturbed and identify any anomalies that could suggest evidence buried beneath the surface. On a typical investigation, the results are either mundane or immediately actionable. Maybe a forgotten septic line, a tree root, or some landscaping debris. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would shift the focus of a case from a double homicide to a story decades in the making. But the Reiner estate was anything but typical. From the first sweep, the radar produced unusual readings. Areas of dense material and voids that shouldn't exist. The lines on the monitor, blinking, jagged, irregular, signaled that something had been intentionally placed underground. Not randomly, not naturally, but deliberately. And the patterns suggested more than just a single object. They hinted at a network of buried items, carefully arranged and concealed. The investigators knew immediately that these were not ordinary garden disturbances. A shovel couldn't produce these anomalies. They weren't the result of erosion, of animal activity, or of any of the mundane shifts that naturally occur over years in soil. These were constructed voids, contained spaces, a deliberate effort to hide something from view. Imagine standing in that backyard, the sun high over manicured lawns, and realizing the earth beneath your feet is not what it seems. The ground is deceptive, safe-looking, calm, and stable. Yet beneath it lies a story that had been meticulously buried, lying dormant for who knows how long. The magnitude of this realization hit the team immediately. They weren't just uncovering objects, they were unearthing secrets. But what kind of secrets? That's where the first confusion set in. At this point, no one knew the answer. And in fact, the more the soil revealed, the more questions emerged. Why were these items here? Who had buried them? And most importantly, what connection did they have, if any, to the murders themselves? The initial excavations revealed sealed containers, metal boxes, plastic-wrapped items, and even some aged wooden crates, each carefully packed and buried with precision. Moisture-resistant materials suggested foresight. Whoever placed these objects had anticipated years passing. They had assumed no one would ever find them. And yet, here were the investigators, digging through the earth and slowly unearthing a hidden narrative. The first containers were opened on-site with meticulous care. Each item inside was cataloged, photographed, and assessed for its age, origin, and potential relevance. It became quickly clear that these were not household objects accidentally lost. They were not forgotten toys, old furniture, or miscellaneous storage. They were personal, specific, and the historical resonance of some objects immediately caught the attention of the team. Several of the artifacts appeared to belong to individuals outside the immediate family. Some were tied to locations and events that had long since faded from public record. Personal letters, photographs, and items of sentimental value began to emerge, each one carrying hints of a story that was decades old. Investigators started piecing together the possibility that the estate was not only a private residence, but also a repository of secrets, intentionally stored, carefully hidden, and meant to remain undiscovered. Even more disturbing were objects whose purpose was unclear. Items that seemed ceremonial, oddly constructed, or deliberately encoded in some way. No one on the team could immediately identify their origin or meaning. And here is where the psychological weight of the dig became palpable. These weren't just items, they were questions in physical form. Each piece demanded interpretation. Each object hinted at a story left untold, a narrative that had been silenced until now. It's important to pause here and consider the emotional atmosphere. Excavating a backyard might sound mundane, but this was no ordinary dig. Investigators were uncovering a hidden history layer by layer, and the tension was thick. Imagine standing there, digging through soil that had been undisturbed for years, realizing that you were the first person to see what had been deliberately concealed. The sense of discovery mingled with dread. It was thrilling, yes, but also deeply unsettling. The discovery of multiple containers suggested deliberate planning. Whoever had buried these objects had anticipated long-term concealment. Some containers were grouped in close proximity, hinting at a deliberate organizational method. Others were isolated, suggesting that certain items were meant to remain hidden at all costs. The investigators began theorizing. Could these objects be related to crimes or events that occurred long before the Reiner murders? Could this property have been used as a secret cache for evidence or items that someone wanted to protect or hide from scrutiny? By the time the first day of excavation ended, the picture was already emerging. The estate, so carefully manicured above ground, was now a site of intrigue below. Each layer of soil removed revealed another clue, another hint that there was more than meets the eye. And yet, even with the discoveries made, the full scope remained unclear. It wasn't simply a case of a few buried items. This was potentially a decades-long accumulation of objects, carefully placed, intentionally concealed, and now finally exposed. And the more the investigators uncovered, the more unnerving the implications became. If these objects truly belonged to events outside the immediate timeline of the Reiner murders, then the estate itself had been a silent witness to long-forgotten stories. It had been a vault of secrets. And in the quiet tension of that backyard, the team realized something chilling. The earth beneath their feet had been holding its secrets not out of randomness, but out of intent. Every dig, every unearthed object, raised new questions. Each item had to be documented, traced, and analyzed. The implications for the investigation were staggering. Suddenly, what had begun as a murder investigation was expanding into a multi-layered inquiry, one that required cross-referencing old cases, personal histories, and forgotten events. Each new discovery added depth to the mystery and suggested that the Reiner estate was far more than just the scene of a tragic crime. It was a key to understanding something hidden for years. And even as they continued, the investigators were aware of the unspoken danger. Uncovering something this significant could have consequences far beyond the estate. Who else knew? Who had placed these items? Why had they been buried in the first place? The questions grew heavier as the dirt was removed, leaving a palpable sense of tension in the air. By the end of that second search, one truth was undeniable. The Reiner estate had concealed secrets, carefully hidden, meticulously maintained, and now exposed. And what came next promised to challenge every assumption investigators had about the property, the family, and the tragic events that had brought them to this point. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. By the time investigators prepared for the full excavation, the Reiner estate had transformed from a quiet, luxurious property into a controlled crime scene unlike any most of the team had encountered. The first radar sweeps had already revealed anomalies. The second search confirmed the presence of voids and containers beneath the soil. But now it was time to get hands-on, to dig. And this is where the stakes and the tension rose exponentially. Excavation is a meticulous, almost ritualistic process. Every shovelful of soil must be examined. Every clump of dirt, every root, and every stray fragment must be logged. For most investigations, this is laborious but straightforward. Here, it felt different. The soil itself seemed heavy, almost deliberate. Each layer removed revealed hints that the ground had been carefully manipulated over the years. The very act of digging was like peeling back decades of carefully laid plans. The team began with the most obvious anomalies, the deepest voids revealed by the radar. At first, the soil was dense, compacted, and unyielding. But beneath the surface, subtle shifts and contours began to emerge. Small depressions became apparent. Faint lines suggested the outlines of rectangular objects. Each discovery confirmed what investigators already suspected. This was not natural. These voids were not the result of erosion or construction mistakes. They were constructed spaces, purpose-built to conceal. The first container uncovered was a metal box, sealed and heavy with age. Its exterior showed signs of rust, but it had been carefully buried in a way that protected it from the elements. The team paused, understanding the significance. Whoever had buried this object had intended it to remain hidden indefinitely. Opening it was not just a procedural act. It was a revelation, a moment of confrontation with history that had been intentionally obscured. Inside the container were items that defied easy explanation. Personal belongings. Objects that seemed to belong to someone outside the immediate family. Artifacts whose purpose or origin were not immediately apparent. Letters, photographs, and memorabilia hinted at connections to events long forgotten. The team cataloged everything meticulously, knowing that each item could hold clues not just about the recent murders, but about something far older and more complex. As the digging continued, patterns began to emerge. Some containers were grouped together, forming clusters. Others were isolated, placed strategically in areas that required more effort to reach. Investigators began theorizing about the reasoning behind these placements. Was it convenience? Security? Symbolism? The answers were not immediately clear, but the careful organization suggested that whoever had buried these items had thought through every detail. What struck investigators most was the consistency of concealment. The containers were buried at varying depths, but all were positioned in ways that made them nearly invisible to casual observers. Some were beneath shrubs. Others were under stone paths. A few were directly beneath landscaped areas that had been meticulously maintained. The care taken suggested not only intent, but a deep understanding of how to manipulate perception, how to make something invisible without destroying it. The process of uncovering these items was slow, methodical, and fraught with tension. Each discovery raised new questions. Who had placed these objects here? Why had they been hidden? And most importantly, how did this relate, if at all, to the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner? These questions haunted the team as they dug deeper, layer by layer, container by container. As the excavation progressed, investigators began to notice subtle signs that the ground itself had been altered over time. Soil compaction patterns, layering differences, and inconsistencies in the surrounding vegetation all suggested repeated access. Whoever had buried these items had returned multiple times, checking, adjusting, and ensuring that the concealment remained effective. This realization added a chilling dimension to the investigation. Whoever was behind the burial had been methodical, patient, and precise, qualities that implied careful planning and long-term intent. The emotional impact on the team was significant. Investigators are trained to maintain objectivity, but there is a human element that cannot be ignored. The sense of uncovering something deliberately hidden, something preserved for decades, created a tension that was both exhilarating and unsettling. Each container was a story waiting to be told, a secret finally exposed. And yet, the full narrative remained just out of reach, hidden beneath layers of soil, history, and silence. By the end of the first full day of excavation, a clearer picture was beginning to emerge. The estate was more than just a site of tragedy. It was a carefully curated repository of hidden objects, each with its own story, each placed with intent. The meticulousness of the burial process, the variety of items, and the strategic placements suggested that the property had been used for concealment long before the recent murders. The implications were profound. If these objects were connected to events or individuals outside the immediate timeline of the Reiner murders, then the estate itself was a silent witness to a history that had been carefully erased from public view. The investigators were not just digging through soil. They were uncovering a narrative intentionally hidden, a story that someone had gone to great lengths to protect. As night fell over the estate, the team paused their work. The containers that had been unearthed were secured and transported for further analysis. The excavated areas were carefully documented, the soil returned to maintain integrity for future investigation. And in that quiet moment, the weight of what had been uncovered settled over everyone present. The Reiner estate had revealed a fraction of its secrets, but even in that small revelation, the scope of what lay beneath became undeniable. This was not a random assortment of buried objects. This was deliberate, calculated, intentional, and it was far more significant than anyone had anticipated. But the most unsettling realization came as the team reviewed the day's findings. The patterns, the placement, the nature of the objects, all pointed to a single conclusion. Whoever had buried these items had expected someone to find them one day. And that meant the story was far from over. What came next would test not only the investigators' skills, but their understanding of history, secrecy, and human intent. The ground beneath the Reiner estate had more to tell, and the next discoveries would shock everyone involved. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment the first container was opened, a quiet unease settled over the investigative team. Metal hinges creaked, dust rose in small clouds, and the air seemed suddenly heavier. At first glance, the items inside appeared ordinary: old letters, trinkets, a few photographs. But as the agents examined them, a disturbing pattern emerged. These were not random possessions. These were deliberate, personal, and in many ways, inexplicable. The first thing they noticed was the chronology. Many of the items predated the Reiner's time in the estate, suggesting that these objects had been in place long before the murders occurred. But they weren't just old, they were significant. Personal objects with markings, inscriptions, or features that linked them to specific individuals. Some had names written on them. Others carried dates, locations, or subtle symbols. Every object seemed to tell a story, but none of the stories made sense in the context of what was publicly known about the family or the property. One of the photographs, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, depicted a scene that immediately puzzled the team. It showed a group of people, some of whom investigators believed had been involved in long-forgotten investigations. Their presence raised immediate questions. Why would this image, seemingly unrelated to the Reiner family, be buried beneath the estate? Who had placed it there, and for what purpose? Next came personal letters, yellowed with age but meticulously folded. The writing inside was intimate, sometimes cryptic, often mentioning events or people investigators could not immediately identify. One letter referenced a disappearance that had never been publicly solved, hinting at connections that no one expected. Another contained references to locations far from Los Angeles, suggesting that the buried items had traveled, at least in origin, before being intentionally concealed. The team also discovered smaller artifacts, trinkets, medallions, and objects that seemed ceremonial or symbolic. Their purpose was unclear, but each item carried weight. The investigators hypothesized that some of these objects might have been used in rituals, private agreements, or personal rites. The ambiguity heightened the tension. No one knew the full story, and yet everyone sensed that these objects were deliberately placed to convey meaning or preserve secrecy. Even the mundane items carried a sense of unease. Simple household objects, utensils, tools, containers, appeared out of context. Some were customized or altered in subtle ways. Some had markings that were intentionally obscured. It was as if someone had wanted these items to exist, but not to be understood. They were preserved, yes, but only for those who knew how to read them. Investigators began cataloging the objects meticulously, photographing every angle, noting every detail. Specialists were brought in to analyze handwriting, materials, and potential historical significance. What emerged was a picture of intentionality. Every item had been selected, every placement carefully considered. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't leftover clutter. These were items that someone wanted buried and protected. The emotional impact on the team was palpable. As law enforcement professionals, they were trained to remain objective, but the more they uncovered, the more unnerving the situation became. They were handling objects that were both familiar and alien, personal and mysterious, mundane and profound. Each item raised questions. Who owned this? Why was it hidden? What was its connection to the estate? And by extension, to the murders themselves? Among the objects, some were particularly alarming. Investigators discovered items that, while seemingly innocuous, had forensic significance. Small fragments of material that could potentially link to unresolved cases. Objects that had been referenced in missing person reports. Even things that suggested knowledge of events that had been thought private or long buried in official files. Every discovery added layers of complexity to the investigation, connecting the estate to mysteries that stretched far beyond the immediate crime. It wasn't just the physicality of the objects that was unsettling, it was the narrative they suggested. Here was a story hidden in plain sight, beneath the soil, waiting to be discovered. These items hinted at relationships, events, and secrets that no one had expected to intersect with the Reiner estate. It was as if the property itself had become a repository of human history, selectively curated by someone with knowledge, motive, and foresight. The agents began to realize something crucial. These objects weren't just about the past, they were about control. Whoever had buried them had intended to control the narrative, to protect certain truths while concealing others. The deliberate nature of the concealment suggested forethought. These items had been stored not just to exist, but to influence the future discovery of events, to ensure that when someone finally did find them, they would tell a specific story, or at least hint at it. Even as cataloging continued, questions multiplied. Why had these objects remained hidden for decades? Who had the knowledge to bury them so precisely? Were they connected to the Reiner murders at all, or did the recent tragedy merely bring long-hidden secrets to light? Could there have been a warning, an unspoken message, or an attempt to preserve evidence of something that had been forgotten? By the end of the initial examination, one truth was clear. The objects buried beneath the estate should not have existed. Their presence defied conventional understanding. Their intentional concealment suggested a level of planning and foresight that raised the stakes for everyone involved. These items were not just evidence. They were clues, keys, and perhaps even warnings. As the team prepared to dig further and uncover additional containers, the weight of their discovery hung in the air. Every object unearthed added depth to the mystery, and every new detail suggested that the story beneath the estate was far larger and far darker than anyone had imagined. The next phase of the investigation promised to uncover more items, each potentially more disturbing and perplexing than the last. And as the team braced for what they might find, one unspoken understanding persisted. These objects were the tangible remnants of secrets someone had gone to great lengths to hide. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment the investigators began sifting through the personal objects, letters, and photographs, one thing became immediately apparent. Some of the items had a history that was far older than the Reiner estate itself. It wasn't just a collection of random memorabilia. It was a curated archive, a hidden network of evidence that connected to cases long thought closed or forgotten. Among the letters and photographs, one artifact stood out: a folded, yellowed sheet of paper with a name written carefully in faded ink. The name was unfamiliar to most on the team, but a few investigators froze, recognition flashing in their eyes. This was a name from a missing person file, a case that had gone cold decades ago. A young individual, reported missing under mysterious circumstances, whose disappearance had puzzled local law enforcement but never garnered significant public attention. The significance of finding this name buried in the Reiner estate could not be overstated. Suddenly, the investigation had expanded far beyond the murders of Rob and Michelle. What had been perceived as a domestic tragedy now intersected with a cold case that had haunted law enforcement for years. The implications were staggering. Why would items connected to a long-forgotten missing person end up buried beneath the lawn of a celebrity estate? Investigators went back to the files, reviewing old reports, interviewing retired officers, and cross-referencing timelines. They discovered that the missing person had been connected, tangentially at least, to a social circle not unlike that which the Reiners had operated within. Entertainment professionals, influential individuals, and acquaintances whose movements were rarely scrutinized publicly. The threads were faint, but they were there, and the buried items suggested that someone had intentionally preserved a record of these connections, perhaps as evidence, perhaps as memory, perhaps as a warning. But the letters and photographs raised more questions than they answered. Some letters referenced dates and locations that didn't match official records. One photograph depicted a location that had long since been demolished, yet the individuals in the image were clearly recognizable. Another letter hinted at events that investigators had no immediate way to verify, mentioning interactions and individuals whose names did not appear in any known reports. The sense of mystery grew with every new discovery. This was not mere coincidence. Whoever had buried these items was sending a message. It was subtle, encrypted, and deeply layered. Each object, each piece of paper, was a breadcrumb leading investigators into a labyrinth of forgotten history. And yet, the identity of the person or people responsible for the concealment remained elusive. The investigation took an emotional turn when investigators reached out to surviving relatives of the missing person. They discovered family members who had long suspected foul play but had given up hope. The discovery of these buried items offered both a glimmer of hope and a renewed sense of dread. For the first time in decades, they had evidence that suggested their loved one had not simply vanished into nothingness. But the implications of that evidence also hinted at a more complex, more dangerous narrative, one that connected their personal tragedy to a web of secrecy that included the Reiner estate. For the investigators, this was a turning point. The focus shifted from the immediate crime scene to the broader context of the estate's history. They began reconstructing the past, tracing property ownership, renovations, and social connections. Every detail was scrutinized, every anomaly investigated. It became clear that the estate had functioned as more than just a home. It had been a repository of hidden histories, carefully curated by someone with knowledge, motive, and foresight. The team faced a delicate balance. On one hand, they had to continue the murder investigation. On the other hand, they were now effectively dealing with a cold case that intersected in ways that were unpredictable and potentially explosive. Resources were stretched. Analysts worked overtime. Specialists were consulted. And through it all, the buried items continued to yield fragments of information, small, tantalizing, and often contradictory. One particularly chilling discovery was a photograph showing the missing person alongside individuals whose presence suggested connections to events that had never been publicly documented. Another item, a journal entry found carefully sealed in a waterproof container, mentioned locations, meetings, and people that investigators had no immediate way to verify. It painted a picture of a hidden network, a set of interactions and events deliberately obscured from public view. The investigators began to hypothesize. Could these items have been buried to protect someone? To conceal evidence? To send a message to the future? Each theory raised more questions than it answered. And with every layer of soil removed, the sense of unease deepened. This was not just a crime scene. It was a historical puzzle, one that required piecing together decades of events, decisions, and secrets. As the investigation unfolded, one truth became undeniable. The Reiner estate had become a focal point for secrets that were not meant to intersect. A missing person file from decades ago, a celebrity home, personal objects deliberately concealed. All of these elements now converged in a way that demanded attention. The implications were profound. The murders, tragic as they were, might have inadvertently exposed a larger, more complex network of concealed events. By the end of the chapter, investigators had documented the connections, analyzed the objects, and traced as many historical threads as possible. Yet one fundamental question remained. Who had buried these items, and why? The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the estate had been deliberately used as a repository. A place where secrets were stored, preserved, and hidden from the world. And that realization brought with it a chilling possibility. If these items had been uncovered now, decades after their concealment, what other secrets might remain buried elsewhere, waiting for someone to find them? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. To understand the significance of what investigators were uncovering beneath the Reiner estate, you have to understand the environment in which these objects existed. Hollywood is a world of image, influence, and control. It is a place where wealth and fame shield secrets, where reputations are meticulously curated, and where silence is often more valuable than truth. And sometimes, that silence is bought at a steep price. The Reiner estate, luxurious and private, represented more than just a home. It was a symbol of success, a fortress of privacy, and a testament to status. But underneath its manicured lawns and carefully landscaped gardens, it had also become a hiding place for things that could never be allowed into the public eye. Objects, letters, and photographs that spoke of events long buried, of interactions and relationships deliberately obscured, now emerged to challenge the very image Hollywood had crafted. Investigators began to realize that wealth and influence had likely played a role in how these items remained hidden for decades. Permissions, renovations, and landscaping could all be controlled by someone with the right resources. Access could be restricted. Records could be manipulated. And above all, people could be persuaded, either willingly or through fear, to remain silent. Hollywood has a long history of stories that vanish quietly, of incidents erased from public memory, of inconvenient truths buried alongside fame and fortune. It is in this context that the significance of the buried objects became even more apparent. These were not random pieces of memorabilia. They were personal, deliberate, and impossible to understand without recognizing the influence and power that shaped their concealment. Whoever had hidden these items had not only considered the physical act of burial, they had considered the social and political environment that would keep them hidden. They had leveraged the culture of silence, the fear of exposure, and the influence of wealth to ensure that the past would remain buried. The more investigators uncovered, the more they began to see patterns. Many of the objects were tied to individuals who had been connected, at least loosely, to Hollywood circles over the past several decades. Some had been associated with high-profile cases, others with scandals that were quickly suppressed. The letters hinted at agreements, promises, and knowledge that might have been dangerous if exposed. And the photographs sometimes depicted people whose identities were deliberately obscured or misrepresented in official records. This was a world where perception mattered more than reality. In such an environment, burying physical evidence beneath a mansion may have seemed like the only way to maintain control. It wasn't just concealment. It was a calculated act of preservation, a silent declaration that certain truths would remain hidden until the person who buried them decided otherwise, or until the soil finally gave up its secrets. Even more unsettling was the realization that some of these items might have been intentionally planted to influence future investigations. By leaving a carefully curated collection buried, someone could shape the narrative that would emerge if the objects were ever discovered. In Hollywood, controlling the story is everything. And here, the story had been controlled at a literal, subterranean level. The psychological and social dynamics of secrecy became a focus for the team. Investigators consulted behavioral analysts and historians familiar with celebrity culture. They examined the ways in which power, fame, and fear intersected to allow secrets to survive. They realized that these objects weren't just artifacts. They were a testament to a culture that thrives on appearances and silences inconvenient truths. Each item became a lens through which the darker side of influence and control could be glimpsed. The emotional tension among the investigative team also deepened. Working on the ground, uncovering items with historical significance, they were confronted with the knowledge that these were tangible remnants of decisions and actions that had been deliberately obscured. There was a human weight to the objects, a story of manipulation, suppression, and perhaps even complicity. Handling these items wasn't just procedural, it was an intimate encounter with power and secrecy. The discoveries also began to challenge assumptions about the murders themselves. While Rob Reiner's arrest addressed the immediate tragedy, the buried objects suggested that there might have been long-standing tensions or knowledge that intersected with the crime in ways investigators were only beginning to understand. Could someone have feared exposure? Could secrets buried for decades have influenced actions that led to the murders? These were questions that remained unanswerable at first glance but demanded exploration. Even beyond the estate, the investigation began to ripple outward. Analysts cross-referenced names and dates with historical records, legal files, and news archives. They discovered that many of the individuals indirectly connected to the buried objects had moved through Hollywood and its periphery in ways that suggested both access and opportunity. Patterns emerged. Wealth, influence, and silence intertwined in ways that allowed secrets to survive in plain sight. The chilling realization was this: The power dynamics of Hollywood had allowed these objects to remain hidden for years, but they also framed the context in which a sudden exposure could be catastrophic. One discovery in the dirt could unravel decades of carefully maintained facades. One container unearthed could force the intersection of old tragedies with current ones, shifting public perception and forcing hidden histories into daylight. By the end of this phase, the investigators were no longer just dealing with a murder investigation. They were facing the implications of a carefully controlled narrative that had survived for decades, now being threatened by exposure. The Reiner estate was not just a crime scene. It was a nexus of power, secrecy, and historical consequence. And yet, for all the analysis, one critical truth remained. The full scope of what had been hidden was still unknown. Each item discovered revealed a new layer. Each letter hinted at more, and each photograph suggested connections that had yet to be explored. The deeper the investigation went, the more it became clear that the estate's secrets extended beyond what any investigator had imagined. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. As the excavation progressed, the investigators began to encounter objects that defied explanation. Unlike the letters, photographs, or personal items discovered earlier, these artifacts were unusual in both appearance and purpose. Some seemed ceremonial. Others appeared almost ritualistic. Their origin was unclear, their purpose even more so. And yet, their presence beneath the Reiner estate suggested deliberate placement. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure they remained hidden and preserved. The first of these artifacts was a small, intricately carved object, roughly the size of a fist. At first glance, it seemed decorative, almost like a trinket collected as a souvenir. But upon closer examination, investigators realized it was something far more complex. The carvings weren't random. They appeared to be symbols, possibly linked to an organization, an event, or a person long forgotten. Specialists in anthropology and symbology were consulted, but even they admitted the markings were unusual, not easily categorized, and potentially unique. Another artifact raised even more questions. It was a container unlike any previously found, metal, cylindrical, and sealed in a way that suggested it could survive extreme conditions. Inside were smaller objects, wrapped carefully in aged cloth. These included personal tokens, fragments of paper, and small tools. Each item appeared to have significance, yet its meaning was obscured. Forensic specialists began testing the materials, hoping to determine age, origin, and possible connection to known events. Investigators realized that these artifacts were not randomly placed. There was a deliberate logic to their positioning underground. Some were clustered near the property's foundation, others under ornamental landscaping, and a few in locations that required considerable effort to reach. This indicated that whoever buried them had intimate knowledge of the estate's layout and had carefully planned their concealment. They were ensuring that these items would survive, undisturbed, for years or even decades. The presence of such objects also complicated the investigation. Up to this point, the focus had been on personal belongings and potential connections to unresolved cases. But these artifacts suggested something deeper. Something symbolic, possibly tied to cultural, spiritual, or secretive practices. It became clear that the estate had been used not just as a residence, but as a repository for items meant to remain hidden, each carrying its own message or significance. Among the artifacts were items that investigators could not immediately identify, and which seemed entirely out of place in a suburban Los Angeles neighborhood. Small sculptures, unusual tools, and even fragments of aged material hinted at origins far removed from Hollywood. Specialists speculated that some items might have been collected during travels, obtained through private networks, or inherited from previous owners. Each object added another layer of mystery, suggesting connections that span geography, time, and culture. The investigative team began documenting the artifacts in extreme detail. Every angle, every marking, every imperfection was recorded. Photographs, measurements, and material analyses were conducted. Experts from multiple fields, anthropology, history, forensics, and art restoration, were consulted to interpret the item's significance. Even with their combined expertise, many of the objects resisted explanation, defying categorization and leaving investigators with more questions than answers. The emotional effect on the team was profound. They were trained to remain objective, but the strangeness of the artifacts introduced a psychological tension. Each discovery seemed to whisper hints of a hidden narrative, one that had been carefully protected and preserved. Investigators found themselves speculating not only about the identity of the person who had buried these items, but also about their motives, intentions, and potential knowledge of events long forgotten. As the excavation continued, the artifacts became a focal point for the broader investigation. They suggested that the Reiner estate was not merely a site of a recent tragedy, but part of a larger historical tapestry, a place where secrets, personal, cultural, and possibly criminal, had been intentionally concealed. The team realized that understanding these objects could be key to interpreting not only the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner, but also the deeper narrative embedded in the estate itself. Some artifacts were even more disturbing. Certain items appeared to be intentionally damaged or altered, as if to obscure their origin or function. Others carried faint traces of materials or substances that hinted at previous handling, storage, or ritualized use. The investigators began considering the possibility that these artifacts were part of a larger pattern of concealment, one that extended beyond the estate and possibly involved other locations, individuals, or historical events. The combination of personal objects, letters, photographs, and now these unexplained artifacts created a complex, multi-layered mystery. The estate had become a microcosm of secrecy, a repository of knowledge, and a puzzle that spanned decades. The team recognized that each discovery increased the stakes. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide these items, and the unearthing of even a fraction of them could have consequences for understanding history, family legacies, and perhaps even unresolved criminal investigations. By the end of the chapter, investigators were left with a daunting task. The artifacts demanded interpretation, contextualization, and verification. Each object was a clue, but the full story remained obscured. The estate had revealed fragments of its secrets, yet the deeper meaning of the artifacts, why they were buried, by whom, and what they signified, remained elusive. And as the team prepared for the next phase of the investigation, one truth was undeniable. The Reiner estate was no ordinary property, and the objects buried beneath it were no ordinary artifacts. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. After days of careful excavation, cataloging, and analysis, the investigative team began to notice a pattern emerging from the scattered discoveries. The buried containers, letters, photographs, and unusual artifacts weren't randomly placed across the Reiner estate. They were concentrated in a way that suggested a central focal point, a hidden area deliberately designed to hold items meant to remain undiscovered. This realization marked a turning point. The investigators were no longer merely uncovering evidence. They were approaching a secret location, a subterranean space that someone had engineered to conceal history itself. The first hints came from subtle variations in the terrain. A section of the backyard, previously thought to be part of the ornamental landscaping, exhibited slight depressions and irregularities. The soil had settled differently here compared to the surrounding area, almost imperceptibly, but enough to catch the attention of investigators. These small signs, combined with the ground-penetrating radar data, pointed to a deliberate cavity, something larger than the individual containers already discovered. As the team prepared to dig, tension was palpable. Every member understood the significance. This wasn't just a hidden container. This was a carefully constructed space designed for concealment, built to remain undetected even to those familiar with the property. Whoever had created it had anticipated scrutiny, had thought about soil density, placement of landscaping, and the long-term durability of the structure. It was a vault of secrets buried beneath one of Los Angeles's most affluent neighborhoods. The excavation began slowly. Layers of soil were removed methodically, each layer documented and analyzed. The first breakthrough came when a reinforced cover, disguised as part of the landscaped garden, was uncovered. It was flush with the ground, almost invisible, and had clearly been engineered to withstand time and environmental pressures. Investigators carefully lifted the cover, revealing an entrance to a space that had been intentionally sealed. Inside was a treasure trove of hidden items, more extensive than any of the containers found above ground. Shelving had been constructed along the walls, holding personal objects, letters, photographs, and the mysterious artifacts discovered in previous digs. Each item had been deliberately arranged, suggesting that the person who created this space intended for these items to be preserved systematically, with care and intention. The contents of the hidden location were both fascinating and unsettling. Letters hinted at unresolved disputes and long-forgotten events. Photographs depicted scenes and individuals whose identities were initially unrecognizable, connecting to the missing person files previously examined. Artifacts, some ceremonial, some inexplicably crafted, were stored with meticulous precision. Every item told a story, yet every story raised new questions. Investigators were struck by the foresight evident in the construction. Moisture-resistant materials, carefully controlled spaces, and strategic placement suggested that whoever designed this location had planned for decades. It was not a haphazard hiding place. It was a deliberately constructed archive, a repository of secrets intended to endure.